Hello everyone, thank you for coming today again to our last session for the Young Scholars on Turkey program. Last session doesn't mean the program ends, right? We have a surprise for you. It's straight out of the oven. We are organizing a conference on April 15th. It's going to be at the University Club of Washington, D.C. It's a one-day conference with three different sessions: domestic politics, EU issues, and U.S.-Turkey foreign policy. We have the program finalized. We'll be announcing it, promoting it shortly next week. I'd like to again thank David Katal with the Institute of Turkish Studies for co-sponsoring this program, and now also volunteering to co-sponsor the conference. Hopefully our collaboration will and co-conspirators, right, will continue. And also the conference has another co-sponsor as well, Ali Burala Global Islamic Studies Center at the George Mason University. So we are appreciative of their support as well. And during this whole program, we've stated it, we've published it. Our modest aim is to bring academics into the policy world and enrich the discussion on Turkey with fresh new ideas, fresh new research. And I think we've been a little bit successful, if I can say so. But hopefully we'll do even a better job next year. We hope that this program continues. As I said, please note your calendars for April 15th, and we will continue after that as well. Today we have Ismail Yaylaci from University of Minnesota. He's a doctoral candidate in political science at the University of Minnesota. He did his master's in political science and international relations at Boğaziçi University, and his research deals with discourses on the transformation of Islamism in world politics. And he deals with many issues, among which Islam and politics, Islamism, with a particular focus on Turkey and Egypt. These are very relevant topics these days, and hopefully he'll bring in some new, fresh perspectives for us. So, after his presentation, we'll open the floor for question and answers. We've been very merciless on the time limitations, so I asked him in your presence as well to limit it to half an hour max, right? 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Hopefully. We have to bargain all the time. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank SETA-DC and Institute of Turkish Studies for inviting me, for having me here, and thank you all for coming. As Kader mentioned, my talk today develops on my broader dissertation project, part of my dissertation project on the discourse of transformation of Islamism in politics, particularly in the case of Turkish Justice and Development Party and Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood within the literature in international language. So today I will deal with the specific discourse of post-Islamism that have risen in the last 2 decades. In the immediate aftermath of the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, especially after the Egyptian revolution, many pundit scholars took on this discourse of post-Islamism. Olivier Roy, for instance, suggested right after the Egyptian revolution that the revolution is a post-Islamist revolution. And Asif Bayat argued that these events in Tunisia and Egypt was a manifestation of new Arab street politics in post-Islamist times. In Turkey too, like many columnist scholars engage with this language, with this discourse. Ali Bulac, Akif Emre, İhsan Doğan, Raymert, all engage with it, mostly critically, but some of them endorsingly. So, what is that discourse? What does it suggest? According to the post-Islamism argument, Islamism was an authoritarian, illiberal, top-down project of Islamizing society through establishing an Islamic state that implements Sharia law. That is how Islamism is posited, is fixed. And post-Islamism, in juxtaposition to Islamism, is a radical break from Islamism, in the sense that it no longer vies for an Islamic state. It no longer vies for implementing Sharia law as the law of the land, but rather incorporates Islam in the form of personal religiosity and ethical guidance rather than as state law, and adopts many liberal constructs such as individual freedom, rights and autonomy, state neutrality toward different religions, and also free markets and free trade. That discourse also speaks is directly speaking to the debates over Islam and democracy, because within that discourse, Islamism, even when it vies for democracy, even when it calls for democracy, it is a democracy, it's an Islamic democracy, as they call it. That is a democracy within the bonds of Sharia, that Mevdudi referred to as theodemocracy, or Murad Hoffman referred to as shuracracy, right? So these kinds of, which actually we see in the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran too, right? A mixing of democratic institutions, mechanisms with some sort of a Sharia. Post-Islamism, however, is posed as a radical qualitative break from that, in the sense that it is no longer Islamic democracy, but it is a Muslim democracy, that is at stake. That is, basically, it's a liberal democracy populated by and run by Muslims. That is, religion enters into the picture in the form of privatized religious ethics rather than state law. And more importantly for our talk today, for my talk today, is that Islamism is construed as a counter-hegemonic, anti-systemic, critical discourse and movement, or in some cases, party. That is, post-Islamism is at its core a post-colonial discourse that is radically anti-imperialist, that is radically counter-hegemonic, anti-hegemonic, and has an alternative, has a vision and a claim for an alternative order based on a civilizational understanding and a different sort of paradigmatic construct. But post-Islamism is construed in a way that these sort of ex-Islamists are no longer claiming for an alternative. That is, Islam is not understood as an alternative sort of vision of order or an alternative civilizational sort of paradigm, but rather, so these post-Islamists engage with the liberal norms and institutions of the international world. That is, they adopt liberal constructs, they adopt liberal values and institutions. So it is no longer a challenge in that sense to international order as Islamism was, the argument goes. So, for instance, in Turkey, Ismail argued that Islamists had to embrace the universality of political modernity. That it was out of a loss of self-confidence, and it was basically out of a defeat and disappointment. Islamists had to sort of give up their claim for an alternative. So what this discourse does, in a sense, is basically two things. First, it creates binaries, as all discourses do. that it creates here the subjects, Islamism and Islamists and post-Islamists. One liberal, one illiberal, one democratic, one authoritarian, one secular, pro-secular, one anti-secular. One engages with the world, one is isolation. One resists, one doesn't resist. One has a claim for an alternative, and the other gives up that claim for an alternative. So the discourse operates through these binaries. And these binaries produces particular subjects. Islamists who have an agency and subjectivity to resist, and post-Islamists who lose the agency to resist. It's basically an argument of giving up. And secondly, linked with that discourse of post-Islamism basically narrates a story of socialization understood as giving up. Or in other words, that story of giving up is a story of socialization. That is, Islamists, the ex-Islamists, here post-Islamists, increasingly engage with the world. So what we have here is that counter to the counter-hegemonic sort of discourse of Islamism, we now see in the post-Islamist discourse an incorporation into the dominant norms and institutions in hegemonic constructs. This is, for instance, the argument that Cihan Tuval makes in his 2009 book, that this is the constitution of hegemony, this is absorption of an anti-secular challenge to capitalist modernity. Right? So the story is basically, the construct is that Islamists who oppose, who have agency and subjectivity, and post-Islamists who give up, who are absorbed, and in that sense is sort of embraced in that sense. So again, as I said, this story is a story of socialization. So what we mean by socialization is that socialization is especially in international relations literature, you will see socialization is the mechanism through which norms diffuse. Right? Socialization is the mechanism through which the norm breakers become norm followers. Right? So, in that sense, in this particular discourse of post-Islamism, the norm breakers, the Islamist norm breakers who oppose the hegemony of the liberal norms and values, become norm followers who are sort of absorbed within these norms and institutions. So it denotes a change in actors' nature, in actors' preferences, and in actors' strategies. And the ultimate purpose in this account of socialization is to produce normalized, disciplined subjects who internalize the dominant constructs, normative constructs, that it becomes a taken for granted value. And we see many explications of this narrative of socialization in the literature, in international relations, and comparative politics. That the discourse that we are all familiar with, that there is a word culture, a word policy that are Western originated norms and institutions diffuse from the West to the rest, and the West is the producer of these norms, and the rest is the passive recipient of these norms. And these global normative constructs that originate in the West basically become global. Then they constitute actors, then they define what is legitimate and what is not legitimate in terms of political program and agenda. As Bereduzan suggests, this is a Eurocentric conception all the way down at its core. So this is, for instance, the story that is told about the expansion of the international society. There is an international society, and it is basically the Westphalian norms and institutions that diffuse. So, according to that logic, modernization, for instance, modernization theory is obvious, is quite within that field. Modernization names the process that starts and ends, and develops in Europe and expands into the non-West. So Tim Mitchell, for instance, suggests that the destiny of the non-West in that account has been to mimic, never quite successfully, the history already performed by the West. So for instance, if you look at the post-Cold War liberal triumphalism, we see the explication of this language, right? The end of history, that the other societies are to socialize the liberal hegemony and there are outliers, but they're going to socialize into something. Right? This is the discourse that we are familiar with. So, post-Islamism narrates a story of socialization, where it is giving up, where the Islamist agency is given up, and this is in Eikenberg and Kapchan's terms, the socialization of the hegemony, right? Or as Tual says, it is constitution of hegemony. Or as Olivier Roy himself suggests, this is liberal normalization, that liberal norms normalize the former Islamists. This is the discourse in general. So, having this binaries within this discourse, we are left with some interpretive challenges, some questions. If post-Islamism is a story of further universalization of Western cultural forms, norms and institutions, then what kind of frictions happen in the travel of these liberal universals? So if post-Islamists appropriate these liberal constructs, so how do they also reappropriate and misappropriate? Right? If we read in Socialization of Islamic Political Movements a certain operation of normalizing power, a disciplining power, an exercise of power, then how are we to also recognize the resistance that coupled this process of normalization? If we are to understand power and resistance always already coupled and coupled. Does post-Islamism simply mean a giving up and end of political Islam in a way that attests to the global homogenization around liberal norms and institutions? So here is where I locate my intervention. This is where I intervene. And I say, given the simplistic accounts, this simplistic reading of Islamism and post-Islamism, I provided different theoretical perspectives, I suggest, to account for the agency in this agency of both Islamists and post-Islamists. In my broader project, I look at both Muslim Brotherhood and Haq Party in Turkey, but in this talk, I'm only focusing on Haq Party. And as I said, I develop a notion of performative socialization. That is, the socialization narrative, his story here we have in this post-Islamism discourse is a weak one, is a narrow one. It does not really account for the full complexity of different Islamist subjectivities. In that sense, it's not helping. It's not a rich account to understand what's going on in terms of the agency and subjectivity of Islamist actors, different Islamist actors. So what is that performative account? Performativity develops, and here I develop on the writings of scholars like Judith Butler, Sabah Mahmoud, trailblazer, and others. Performativity basically, as I understand it, is that the agency is entailed not only in resisting norms, but also in inhabiting norms differently. That is, agency is entailed in repeating a norm, repeating a script differently. That is, in introducing a difference, a variation in the repetition of a norm. That is not the whole story, that's part of the story. So agency in that sense cannot be located solely in acts of revolutionary acts of creating a political tabula rasa, right? It is also entailed in introducing difference, variation in repeating a particular script. Butler, for instance, suggests that norms and discourses can be taken up because discourses are open, right? So norms and discourses can be taken up in a way that might be counter to the intentions that they were designated for. In that sense, norms can be performed non-normatively, and conventions can be reversed non-conventionally. And the promise of the performative in that sense is precisely this, that norms can be inhabited with an agential capacity, with a difference. Difference can be introduced in a particular norm, And this is what happens when the liberal category and the universal categories travel, right? This is where you introduce frictions. Then, I mean, for instance, then we can talk about, Butler talks about subversive repetitions, for instance, that repeating a norm in a way that runs counter to it, that displaces the norm, that re-territorializes the norm. Right? So, if we are to understand socialization, that is, if we understand socialization as making norm breakers into norm followers, that is, repeating a particular script and more, for instance, the story of socialization, then the challenge then is to look at how, right? Because when we talk about performative socialization, the question is not whether to repeat, but how to repeat. So that is also where agency is entailed. That is also where difference, variation is introduced. So then the question turns into the question of how does AK Party repeat that norm, right? AK Party in this discourse is constituted as the paradigmatic example of post-Islamism. Right? This is something that you see all over the place. That is, so if we adopt this performative socialization account, how are we to understand AK Party's engagement with the liberal international movement? What kind of differences does it introduce in repeating that norm rather than rejecting it? In repeating that norm, how are we to understand the subjectivity of AK Party? That's an empirical question. That is something to go and search for. And here I will only, because of the time constraint, I will only toss around like 3 points that I see relevant in order to start the conversation on that. That if we embrace that performative account of socialization, as if we understand agency as entailed also in repeating a norm differently in a way that might run counter to the original purposes of the norm, then how are we to understand the AK Party case in engagement with international order? I will make only 3 points and quick points to start the discussion. And these are suggestions. And as I said, I hope I said, I'm in the early stages of my broader project, so I really welcome your comments, critiques, and suggestions, especially on this reading. The first is that when we look at the foreign policy discourse and practice of AK Party, we see a simultaneous acknowledgement and critique of the post-war international political architecture. That is, on the one hand, you have a thorough sort of internalization of the discourse of the operation of international order. For instance, where you see the language of legitimacy and legality as being highly employed. And for instance, you see in AK Party foreign policy an eagerness to engage with international institutions like NATO, UN, EU, and other international organizations, through OIC and others, and also regional organizations. There is a great effort in that sense to, especially when you look at the post-war international architecture, AK Party is participating in it, but with a critique of it. That is, for instance, when AK Party, when Turkey was elected to the UN Security Council with a high number of votes by the member countries, this was interpreted by the policymakers as a sort of a demonstration, as almost like a proxy for their critique of the UN system, the hierarchical, the exclusionary character of the UN system. That we voiced these critiques so that people voted, the countries voted for us for the UN Security Council, for instance. I mean, we can talk about it. Second is the AK Party foreign policy on regional integration. If you look at the language of Turkish foreign policy in the last 8 years, it's a deeply liberal language of putting all the promise in the free trade and free markets. Right? This is a purely liberal language, liberal institutionalist, functionalist language. That is, through trade, through daily interactions, we're going to end up in peace and prosperity. And the language of win-win was very prominent, right, in Turkish Forum, and it still is. This is, I think, it is a deeply liberal language that is being spoken. But on the other hand, or together with it actually, it is also fulfilling fulfilling the Islamist, the classical Islamist project of getting closer to an idealized community of Ummah, for instance. Although the language of Ummah isn't there. There's nothing to do with Ummah. There is no language of a rejectionist language, isolationist language of saying the Islamic world versus the West. For instance, in some of the, if you look at the Arabican language, you have a vision of saying, oh, we're going to create a UN for Islamic world, a NATO for Islamic world, a EU for Islamic world, UNESCO for Islamic world, a euro, a common currency for the Islamic world. Right? So this was a vision of solidarity among Muslim countries. That was achieved, I think, I would suggest, in Ak Party, but through transcending it, not replicating it. That is, that much of cooperation, that much of solidarity that the classical Islamist sort of discourse called for is achieved in a way that Islamism couldn't achieve. But this is done through a liberal language. This is done through inhabiting the existing scripts, liberal scripts, differently, in a way that might not be reduced to liberal sensibilities. Not rejection of it, but cannot be reduced to liberal sensibilities. This is something I think we're going to ask about. Last point is about being an alternative. Again, this is foreign policy discourse. I mean, if Ahmet Davutoğlu's writings mean anything for Turkish foreign policy, and if you look at even the titles of the books, the first one, Alternative Paradigms, the second one, Civilization Transformation, and the third one, Global Crisis. This is not a happy endorsement of international order, right? And if we analyze, obviously this is only his writings as a scholar before he became official, but I will argue that Turkish foreign policy has a critical language with Buddhist engagement with international order, with international institutions. For instance, you will see again a critique of the UN system by the foreign minister himself. A critique of inequalities. For instance, when you hear the foreign minister Davutoğlu speaking about we represent the global south or something of that sort, or we are the central country that the north and the south meets, things like that. That it is not a happy endorsement, it is not a socialization, it's not a giving up. There is still I would argue, a counter-hegemonic force in it, but it is not the rejectionist language. It is not. It is rather a engagement with international norms and institutions in a way that introduces agential capacity, that introduces a variation in the repetition of the script. This is what I call performative socialization. And this is what I think is going on when we talk about Ak Party. Again, this is foreign policy, not the post-Islamism. And if you look at the specific events, the famous Davos event, or the Erdogan critique of Israeli incursion into Lebanon and Gaza, and I mean, I think if you analyze the discourse and practice of the Turkish foreign policy in the last 8 years, we see a lot of critique of the international system, its inequalities, its hierarchies, its exclusions, but through engaging with it. So, in conclusion, I would say, I would refer to Bob Walker's 1984 writing. He says, much of the discussion of contemporary order is still preoccupied with the dynamics of the spread of and resistance to a universalizing West. I think that is still true. it is still at stake. And I think that AK Party foreign policy is responding to that spread in a way that I think performative socialization economy helps us understand better. So here I leave, and I'm happy to get questions, critiques, suggestions.
Thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you for being here. Very interesting, and we'll save the best for last. And I like the model, but as a historian, I just have a couple observations that I really tease. One is that there is this sort of false dichotomy. If you look at Western Europe basically derived huge civilization strength from the Arab world. I mean, for instance, transmission of Greek heritage, all of these things comes through from Spain and whatever. So, the one thing that sort of sounds as if there's this dichotomy here, which is really sort of a false dichotomy. Another small critique is that, AK Party has done a lot of things, but they are not, I think there's a continuity that goes back a longer time. Again, I take the historical viewpoint. And that if you look at sort of late 19th century, they are very much accurate. They were leaders of the state that had influence. And so it's not quite so passive before the 1800s. A good deal of this transformation is already in place because of people like Devish and Jim. I don't think you're saying something different than just one. But I do find this to be a very thought-provoking presentation. And I guess my questions would really surround as to it's not fair, but where do you think it goes from in terms of how does this play out? How does Turkey's role play out in effectively the Islamic world? Do they become a model? Is it adopted? Are there variations of this adoption of liberalism as opposed to the Turkish Republic? If that makes sense.
So, in terms of the dichotomy question, I totally agree with you. So one thing actually that this post-Islamism discourse does, that I critique, is that precisely this dichotomy that it creates. Because it is a discourse that says, you know what, you had a claim for a civilization alternative, but you ended up integrating in it. But if you look at, for instance, say, again, just a suggested remark here, say, if you look at writings of, say, Ahmet Davutoğlu, he's talking this language of civilization, but there's this huge stress on cross-fertilization, on hybridity, on mutual exchanges between these cultural information. So, indeed, in my broader project, I have a sort of particular chapter on critique of the civilization politics that is within this post-Islamism, which is strictly this, like relying on this dichotomy of say, East-West or Islam-West or what have you. So, so I agree with you on that. Continuity in Turkish foreign policy, yes, that's a huge debate in Turkey too, and I think there is a significant amount of continuity in Turkish foreign policy. This is something that Turkish foreign policy makers also share and agree. Say Ismail Cem's tradition, or even before, if you look at Bülent Ecevit's foreign policy, there is the relations with the US or with broader terms with the international order is something sort of similar to what we see today. But my engagement, my critique of post-Islamism is that this foreign policy, when it is contrasted with Islamist foreign policy, policy, Islamist vision of foreign policy, that it is a failure. It's a sort of giving up. So the Akbari foreign policy is a foreign policy of giving up of Islamist claims, sort of thing. So I think if you look at the question from the broader sort of long durée of Turkish foreign policy, then obviously there are continuity. But when contrasted with the prior Islamist discourse of world order, of foreign policy, then this is construed as a radical shift, as a radical break from Islamist politics. And I think that is problematic, not to reject it. But I think the picture is complicated. This is why I introduced a much more complicated account of agency. And where does it go from here? I don't know.
That was an unfair question.
I mean, yeah,
It's a little panel on that.
I mean, again, coming back to my critique of my engagement with this post-Islamism discourse, that discourse essentially concerns Turkey and Akbari as a model for the Islamist movements in the Arab world in general. But precisely because it is construed as a story of giving up. This is my argument that we can discuss. That it is a movement, it is a discourse that no longer calls for the ideals that used to be called for in classical Islamist discourse. I do think that there is a difference. By the way, I don't wanna communicate a message that says there is no difference. I do think that there are substantial differences. I only differ from its reading, how I read it. I think it's interpretation. So I don't think Akbari leadership, for instance, has a problem with being shown as a model, though they don't really put it as they work, right? So this kind of. So, and I do think Akbari engagement with the dominant norms and institutions is an important experience. This is why I choose it as my dissertation. But I differ in terms of its depiction with the post-Islamism discourse. But I do think there is important insight. Though this is also different from taking Turkey as a model, because then you have all the problems with the authoritarian establishment in Turkey with all its legal sort of bureaucratic architecture. Yes.
It's okay. Go ahead.
My question, thank you very much for your concept of performative. I find it very useful, but as I understand it, it's a very fragile, well-calculated but fragile equilibrium that is still performed all the time between acknowledgement, endorsement, and rejection. My question is about the sustainability of such a strategy and the limitations of it. As we see, especially in a radical change of context, for example, today in the Muslim Brotherhood region, where the reading of Egyptian politics has been completely challenged, and if not rejected by political development. So my question is about how sustainable and are there any limitations to this kind of constant calculation?
That's a great question. And one thing that when I toss around the concept of, and I try to develop the concept of performative socialization, it is still socialization. So it is still challenging the arguments that it is either socialization that you give up, or it is not socialization and that you have an isolated conception of order and you have a clinical alternative. But rather, I really want to see that hybridity working. So it is an engagement, but it is performative in the sense that when these universal concepts, notions, solid sort of norms and institutions travel, you introduce difference in it. Then you have friction. Then you have this is what politics is all about. So the sustainability, I rather want to posit this as a as an analytical category, as an to better interpret the case, rather than as a political project. I don't want to suggest that somebody would come. Yes, let's do performative socialization, but rather I look and say, what's going on is a performative socialization. So I agree with fragility, because this is why this is politics, right? So this is why we're not doing sort of Platonic, exact, absolute politics, right? We are engaging with messy political reality, that always constant engagement, constant friction and contestation, and over norms, over filling in the universals, for instance, things like that. So sustainability and limitation, these are, first, when I went to Egypt this summer, this was something that I very much saw in the Muslim Brotherhood circles. That Muslim Brotherhood was in its sort of early stages when Ak Party was established. And I would say till Ak Party's sort of critique of the Gaza war. Before that, there was a huge suspicion toward Ak Party. So what's going on? Because they would also read it as a story of subsumption. That is, it's a story of absorption. But after that, now they see it rather as a I would say, again, a different engagement with the international order. It is not isolation. It's rather for the TBD. And there is an agency going on that you can see that is introduced in some ways or another. So, for instance, this is why you see, especially in the Muslim Brotherhood youth in Egypt, there's a lot of sympathy for Ak Party. This is why Brotherhood wants to be much more engaged with Ak Party. Sure, then YSOT Party seems to be like, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that too, because YSOT parties, although it broke away from Brotherhood, it had the implementation of Sharia as its goal. So this is why they say, you see, in Egypt you still don't have a post-Islamist party, because there's still demand for implementation of Sharia.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the speech, first of all, and I'm sorry for my English. Maybe I try my best to make it clear what I'm thinking. And first of all, I believe there's a difference between of course, Egypt, the revolution in Egypt, and Turkey. It's like a revolution against the Shah in Iran in 1979, and leftists, the conservatives and the liberals are all against the Shah, and they get together like today in Egypt, and they overthrow the Shah. However, if the first election, or I should say after that, the first president who is very moderate, then after that, we see now today Iran is not a democratic state. I believe Turkey should be definitely a role model for Egypt, and it will be one. I totally agree with you that Muslim Brotherhood are going to act like Ak Party, and I hope they will be, but I know actually. So, however, the only problem is Ak Party have a different experience than Egypt, and they fight. The first start with the Refah Party, I should say. I don't know how to say it in English, the Welfare Party. And, with the democratic institutions already in place in Turkey, okay, there is an establishment, however, we have a very free election and everything. And now Ak Party is, the last 8 years or more, they are the first party. So I try to say, Egypt has a different experience. I hope they will not end up like Iran, but they will end up like Turkey. And I will see how the military, I think this is the only establishment left in Egypt, will react the first elections after Muslim Brotherhood win. And what do you think?
Expect that?
Yeah, I expect that. I expect that.
You hope that?
No, I expect that. I hope that too. As I told you, I believe Turkey will have more allies in that region, like Egypt, Tunisia. I don't know if how much you interact with the Arabs from that region in this country. They literally like Turkey. I mean, they always like to be the Turkey now. So I believe we will see more of like democratic, more liberal countries in the region.
Okay, so audience is pushing you to make a comparison between Turkey and Egypt. So maybe you should, and I have reservations about that as well, also for other reasons. Now it's becoming a political party, whereas our party did not really rely on such an organized movement that was spread over years. But there are really fundamental differences, and then the relationship with the military, etc. These are issues that are being discussed in the camp very heavily these days. So maybe you can talk about that comparison.
Sure. I totally agree that the context in Egypt and Turkey are radically different. The domestic political settings are radically different. And there's a difference in international sort of relations of these countries. No significant similarities. But I think there's these two questions speak both to what's sort of the empirical description of what's going on. So how do you see the difference between these two contexts? And part of your question is also the language of hope. That I hope that literature intervenes. I hope I expect. I think that will be the second part I will try to answer. Obviously, Egypt is a very different context. Ak Party is seen as considered as a formerly Islamic, post-Islamist, mild Islamic, modern Islamist. All over the place you see these different confusion about how to define Ak Party, right? And but when you look at Egypt, there is an authoritarian establishment, no space for contestation really. That has its second article in the constitution that posits in the second article in the constitution that it's a Sharia state. That Sharia is the source of legislation in the country. And you don't have a party. For example, you don't have a party of Muslim Brotherhood, but you do have a party platform of Muslim Brotherhood, which runs independent members. Only for the 444 seats, only runs for 150 because not to scare the regime too much. And despite the incredibly fraudulent elections, gets the 88 of them, right? This is the story that we had in 2005. And the internal frictions within Egyptian society, sectors, groups, ideological groupings are also different from them. It is not similar. And structurally, if you look at it, what you have in Turkey is I think is a breaking point. The 1946 election, when you introduce elections, or the first European election in 1950, when you introduce that as a factor in politics, then you have a radically different configuration of domestic politics reform. Right? So you have elections in Egypt, everybody knows that it's fraud, it doesn't work. And it's only used to scare outsiders that if I allow a little bit of political freedom, then you're going to have these folks in power, and you know what's going to happen in things like that. So I never want to suggest that the context are seen. But what I do suggest is that this post-Islamism discourse, the depiction of Ak Party as a model to post-Islamism discourse is a call for other Islamist movements to say to give up this claim for a Sharia state of some sort. And then you have debates over why Muslim Brotherhood cannot liberalize. What is the problem with this Muslim Brotherhood that they do not liberalize? Even the splitter movement, the YSOT party, still grapples with this notion. And I have a problem, I think, with this kind of narrative, right? Because that does not respect challenge to the free development of politics. Right? This is, even when Turkey is depicted as a model, Turkey itself is depicted as a model, you see the veneration, cherishing of the role of military. You have, for instance, say, a lot of people. More recently, I remember Shimon Peres saying, Turkish military is the only military that protects democracy, right? Through 4 or 5, I don't know, coups. And what democracy is protected precisely at the moments of destruction, right? This kind of, then this is being justified through a particular fear of a different form of politics, a different claim, with all its problems. But I don't think it is, when we come to your the second part of your question about the hopes, about the prescriptive moment, I don't think it's advisable in a policy context to suggest that we should have military that will check and keep the country in a place. This is the bad side of Turkey. It's not something to be replicated. It is something to be getting rid of. Right? So if we want to see, I mean, this is real. If we want, we might not want for some reason. If we want to see an effective just democracy operating in Egypt, we have to allow people to decide what kind of institutional structure they want to have through debates and discussion. I don't think having a stick out like post-Islamist, because what I think is that this is a transcending of Islam, but it's not a negation of it. So the term post is, I think, a little bit problematic. I mean, the conclusion of by way of concluding my dissertation, I'm thinking of writing something like, is the post-Islamism same with the post-modernism? Because when we talk about postmodernism, it's not a break, it's transcending in some ways. This is why people say postmodernism doesn't mean anything, it's late modernism. I don't think post-Islamism is something that, this project is gone, let's look. It's rather like transcending it through its possibilities.
You told us that there was this performative socialization within, when we look at the Turkish foreign policy, especially within the apartheid policy. It seems to define it that way. But if we were to say, well, Turkey never that seen anything in the first place, and there is a different context, without that party, it would have acted the same way, given that so many other actors around the world are criticizing the same international order, and it's not even critique in many ways. Grand system, is problematic, and all sorts of critiques came from all around the world. So my question is, what makes the party experience title different than what is that crucial aspect it brought to foreign policy of Turkey? Given the setup, we are very focused on foreign policy, so I have to bring you there as well. But before you answer, I want to take a couple more questions if we have more. Yes.
You cited three examples of difference. They were all in the sphere of international relations. And but this construct of a liberal democracy is more, I think, concerned with the relationship between the government and the people. And so that's a project that has been for a long time, as far as the adoption of Turkey. So I'm just wondering if you can cite any differences in terms of the domestic government. I mean, it's a moving target.
Okay, that's a great question. That can also be other questions you want to ask. Okay, sure. I mean, I basically gave 3 points, 3 examples from policy, right? And there's also this economic dimension that I did not really mention, and I don't want to go to that way because then this is not something that I focus on much. But in terms of domestic policy, and especially in terms of relationship with government and people, I think it very much, again, develops on a liberal democratic sort of notion. A liberal operates within, I mean, this is more so when compared to foreign policy. And I think that is much to do with the domestic political structure. It is construed as the only language through which you can challenge the authoritarian establishment within and outside. This is something that, as an international relations theorist, I would challenge on normative grounds, but this is the fact on the ground. Right? So, any reference to Islam is outlawed, and it is a reason, and has been the reason for closing down the party, which had been the case for the English movement for decades. Even in its current situation, the party came close to being closed down, shut down by the Constitutional Court of 2008. So I think much of it has to do with. I don't think that discourse that develops is a national outgrowth in one sense. It is an outcome of a willingness to operate within the bounds of the Turkish system. This is why you enter into the democratic system. Right? But I mean, in a couple of occasions, you see differences between a liberal sense of liberal democracy, democratic institutions, and a much more AK party. Of course, this is why you had a debate between people were talking about, is there a rupture between the liberals and AK party? So this kind of thing, and this is why AK party is treated itself much more on the this notion of conservative democracy. That is not the liberal democracy that they want to keep a space for introducing some difference, but they couldn't do it really. Because, as I understand it, what's happening right now is that even if AK party can fulfill the promises of liberal democracy at its full, then that's going to mean a lot. I think this is a goal that they set for themselves right now. But still, when we talk about AK party, obviously we're talking about a coalition. A coalition of liberals, Islamists, more conservative, much more nationalist, and all that. So, in terms of the government and state, government and people, the relations between state and people, society, the only difference again that is being introduced is, for instance, there was a attempt to introduce a ban on adultery, for instance, but they couldn't do it because of the EU pressure. And I mean, even for instance, think of the headscarf, ban on headscarf and upward position. It is a liberal language of fulfilling the promise of liberalism. Because then, even if that is fulfilled, then that will mean a lot not only for the Islamists in Turkey, but also for everyone. That then I think they think that there will be an equal ground for competing in elections. This is what I basically think about AK party's engagement with politics. So not much. I mean, AK party foreign policy has been much more assertive in that sense, in a way that even drives. This is why people wrote about AK party is utilizing foreign policy or developing a foreign policy that is much more Islamically oriented in terms of sensibilities than its domestic policy. And I think this is not a natural outgrowth of development, because this is how the Turkish system is structured, legally, bureaucratically. So when we come to Kadir's question about the counterfactual, that it would have acted the same way if AK party wasn't there, I mean, this is counterfactual, right? This is. But even if we.
You're the one who started with the theory, so we can go.
Sure, I'll go with it. Even if we think that.
Because the argument is that
everything
that's being done right now is within the parameters of national interest for Turkey. It's not something that is being brought for a particular agenda and trying to sort of what came out from your presentation. I'm afraid it may not be true, but it's there are these things that we want to do. We can only do those if we engage with the international order. Whereas if you ask Davutoğlu, of course, right now, right, he would say this is in our national interest, what we are doing, and criticizing the international order is nothing really that new.
Yeah, I think I got your question. I don't think I argue that AK Party foreign policy is devoid of concern for national interest. But what matters is that how you define your national interest. Turkish national interest in foreign policy has, I don't think, never been defined through that kind of an engagement. I mean, you have like various instances in hegemonic period, or when Ismail referred to when Ismail brought EU and OIC countries together. This was like hinting toward that direction. Or some other instances you can also find when Turkish foreign policy turned towards the Middle East, in Baghdad and others. But I don't think that counterfactual holds. It says that if a party wasn't there, then you would have the same foreign policy. Then why do we have this much of debate about change of access? Right? This was a huge concern, not only in Turkey but also internationally, that Turkey is changing access, that there's something new going on, and that is not exactly fitting within the traditional sort of flow of Turkish foreign policy, because Turkish foreign policy has always been, again, conditional. There's mostly operated on the basis that it's in our interest to show that we are always on one side, that we are always pro, that we are always like socializing into this thing.
Let me push you a little more. End of the Cold War, and there are new dynamics. And Turkey is responding to the new dynamics. In that sense, wouldn't the country act the same way, regardless of this?
Sure. If you look at the Özal period foreign policy, like opening to the Turkic people or the in general Muslim countries, but basically the Central Asian countries. Right? So then, for instance, you have the concept of new Ottomanism even used in that period. That this is a new Ottoman foreign policy and all that. But I don't think that follows. Even